All right, so get this. Have you ever felt like all the ways we usually talk about work stress, like they just kind of scratch the surface? Like, oh, I'm feeling burnt out.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, what's underneath that? What's really going on?
Right.
Well, we're diving into the world of humanitarian aid work today. And let me tell you, this PhD thesis about Doctors Without Borders that we're looking at.
Yeah.
Really eye-opening stuff about why people in these really high-stakes jobs end up dissatisfied.
It really goes beyond just like the burnout narrative we hear so much about,
Right.
which is so prevalent.
Yeah, you almost go in expecting that, right? You think, oh, humanitarian aid workers, they're going to be stressed, they're going to be overworked, they're probably a little disillusioned.
Of course. Yeah.
This research kind of digs into the why behind all that.
Exactly. And so the author takes all those common experiences that we're talking about, the stress, the frustration, that feeling of being stuck, and argues that they're all part of this broader concept called dissatisfaction. But here's where I think it gets really interesting, is they kind of challenge the traditional models of what actually causes that dissatisfaction.
So usually we think, oh, unmet expectations.
Right. Yeah.
You go in wanting to save the world, and then bam, reality check. You have limited resources, you have bureaucracy. And
Right. Or you're constantly hitting these roadblocks, trying to get things done. You're trying to make things happen in a system that feels beyond your control. That's kind of like the classic blocked actions model of it. But this thesis adds another layer, saying that those models miss this really crucial element, which is trust.
Okay.
And specifically trust in the system that you're working within and the people at the top making decisions.
So it's not even just what you're doing, it's your whole relationship to the work that you're doing.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Like imagine you're on a project where the goals keep shifting because of factors outside your control. Even if you technically succeed, you might still feel dissatisfied if you don't trust the process, if you don't trust the people who are making those decisions.
Absolutely. And the author uses this really interesting term, meta-emotion, to describe it.
Meta-emotion.
Yeah, so it's like you're not just reacting to the event itself, but how it makes you feel about your place in the whole system.
Okay, I think I get it. It's like when you get a flat tire.
Okay.
You're not just mad about the flat tire, right? It's the timing of it.
Right.
It's the way that it impacts your day.
Right.
It's maybe even this feeling of like, ugh, why am I always unprepared?
Yes.
It's deeper. It's deeper than the flat tire.
Exactly. It's about your own values and your experiences and how you perceive the power dynamics that are at play.
Okay.
And this is where I think their research on Doctors Without Borders, or MSF as they call it, comes in.
So we've got this framework now for kind of understanding dissatisfaction, and it's already got me thinking about, past jobs, honestly. But how does this actually play out in a high-pressure field like humanitarian aid?
Yeah.
And that's where this deep dive into Doctors Without Borders, I think it's really fascinating.
Right. And using MSF as kind of a case study allows the author to really sort of explore these dynamics in a very specific context. But the interesting thing is, even if you've never worked with an organization like MSF, I think these insights are incredibly relevant.
Yeah, it's like holding up a magnifying glass to this one organization to try to understand these bigger dynamics of a whole sector almost.
Exactly. And the way the author does this is by looking at MSF on multiple levels. They call it this multi-level analysis.
Okay.
Macro, meso, micro. So it's kind of like zooming in from the big picture all the way down to like the everyday lived experiences of individual aid workers.
Okay, so from the overall mission and structure of MSF all the way down to what it's actually like to be on the ground making decisions in the field.
Precisely. And at each of these levels, what they find is this tension between individual agency and the needs of the organization.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
Right. On the one hand, you have these really passionate individuals who are driven to make a difference in the world.
Yeah.
And then on the other, you have the organization itself with its rules and its procedures. And let's face it, sometimes its limitations.
Absolutely. And that tension can manifest in so many ways. For example, one thing the author talks about is this constant push and pull between medical priorities and logistical realities.
Right.
Like wanting to provide the highest standard of care while also needing to reach as many people as possible with limited resources.
Oh, absolutely. It's like that classic dilemma of, do you stick to the rule book or do you bend the rules to respond to the urgency of a situation, knowing that both choices have consequences?
Exactly. Or the internal competition for resources and recognition between different teams. That can create so much pressure and uncertainty for individuals who are just trying to do their best in incredibly challenging circumstances.
And that's got to be where that lack of trust that we were talking about earlier starts to seep in, right? Because if you constantly feel like you're battling the system or you're not even sure if your voice is being heard, it's got to take a toll.
You're hitting the nail on the head. These constant tensions, this uncertainty, it erodes trust and agency, which, as we talked about, directly contributes to this overall feeling of dissatisfaction.
Right.
But here's, I think, what's even more interesting is that the author argues that humanitarian work, by its very nature, might be especially prone to these issues.
Okay, so it's not just the high stakes and the tough conditions. We're talking about something inherent to the work itself.
Yes.
That makes it even more susceptible to this dissatisfaction than other high-stress fields. What is it about the work that makes it so unique? So there's something about the actual work itself that makes it more vulnerable to this dissatisfaction.
Yeah, it's not just that it's high stakes and the conditions are really tough. We're talking about something inherent to the work itself.
Okay, so what is it about the work that makes it so unique?
Yeah, so the author points to a few key factors. The first is, just think about the environment that a lot of aid workers are in. Mm-hmm.
They're often isolated. The work is incredibly demanding. They're completely immersed in it. So it's like, how do you even unwind when going home isn't really an option?
Yeah, you can't just leave it at the office and you're living it.
Exactly. And the author actually talks about this in terms of refuge activities.
Sure.
Those things that we all do to kind of de-stress and reconnect with ourselves and find some sense of normalcy outside of work.
Yeah.
Those are really hard to come by in this line of work. And it's not just the individual level either.
Oh, so there's organizational factors at play as well.
Absolutely. Think about how, compared to a more traditional workplace, how easy is it to challenge authority or advocate for change within a humanitarian organization?
Yeah, good point.
Often you're dealing with these really strict hierarchies, power imbalances, this constant sense of urgency, so to speak.
Yeah.
Even when it's really necessary, can feel risky. So you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place where you're in this really tough environment. You may not feel like you have a ton of control. And on top of that, you may not even feel comfortable voicing your concerns.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's tough.
And then on top of that, you have the nature of the work itself. Humanitarian aid often involves moving from project to project, team to team.
Right.
What the author calls this kind of multi-situational aspect.
Okay.
Which makes it really hard to build lasting support networks or even to see the impact of any changes that you do manage to make.
It's like you're constantly the new kid on the block.
Yeah.
Never really feeling settled or part of the team or able to dig in and make a difference long term.
And here's, I think, the real kicker is that because those in charge are often pretty removed from the day-to-day realities of the field, this emotional strain, this dissatisfaction can become almost invisible.
It's like a perfect storm.
Yeah.
You have this system where people are working incredibly hard under immense pressure, feeling dissatisfied.
Yeah.
And then, because of the way the work is structured, those feelings aren't necessarily acknowledged or addressed.
Yeah, and this is where I think the author's observations about different generations of aid workers get really interesting, because they suggest that these experiences of dissatisfaction have kind of shifted over time alongside the evolution of humanitarian work itself.
Okay, I'm very interested to hear more about this.
Yeah.
Tell me about these different generations and how their experience of dissatisfaction kind of plays out.
So you have the first generation, those who kind of entered the field in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
They were kind of the trailblazers, right? They were working in a much less structured environment with a lot more autonomy and flexibility.
Yeah.
And so they might have experienced less dissatisfaction simply because they had more control over their work.
I can see that it was a different world back then, less bureaucracy, a lot more kind of room to make your own way.
Exactly. And then you have the second generation kind of coming in during the 90s and 2000s. And they often had these very idealistic expectations fueled by media portrayals of humanitarian work as this, purely heroic endeavor.
Right.
But they were entering a field that had become much more formalized, much more bureaucratic. And so that clash between expectation and reality likely contributed to a different type of dissatisfaction.
I can only imagine running up against those walls of bureaucracy when you're just trying to do good in the world. It's got to be disheartening.
And then now you have the third generation, so those entering the field from, the 2010s to today.
Okay.
And they're coming in with much more, I'd say, realistic expectations, thanks to, I think, greater awareness and education and open discussions about the challenges of humanitarian work.
So more jaded, but maybe also better prepared.
Perhaps. But it raises this question of, does increased professionalism actually address the root causes of dissatisfaction?
Right.
Or does it just equip people to cope with a system that's still inherently flawed?
Right. It's like you can give people better tools to navigate the storm, but if you don't address the storm itself, have you really solved the problem?
And I think that's what's so powerful about this research is it's not just offering observations.
Yeah.
It's pushing us to think critically about how we organize work, how we value the people who are doing that work, and how we create systems that are both effective and sustainable in the long run.
It really is, and it's a powerful reminder that even in the most demanding fields, people deserve to feel valued and heard and empowered to do their best work. And that's something we can all take to heart no matter what line of work we're in.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been such a thought-provoking deep dive. I feel like we've gone way beyond that kind of typical conversation about burnout and stress to really understand these complex dynamics at play in humanitarian work.
Yeah.
But also, honestly, in any field where people are giving their all under really challenging circumstances. So until next time, deep divers.